emergencies and disasters come in various forms. Think about what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Some are man-made. How do we respond? How do we plan? I'm going to ask each panelist one question to start. And then I'm going to ask an open or broader question, and then we're going to open up to the group. Now, while this topic is broad, we're going to devote this webinar to the objects. We're going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca, you have previously served as the chair of the American Institute for Conservation Emergency Committee, and you have over a decade of experience with collections care. To start the conversation, will you please walk us through the 10 agents of deterioration?
Sure. So the 10 agents of deterioration are some of the most common things that can happen negatively to your collection. For the people who aren't familiar with them, this consists of physical force, fire, pest, light, incorrect humidity, incorrect temperature, thieves and vandals, water, pollutants, and dissociation. The reason we talk about them is that if something goes wrong, anything can be traced back to one of these 10 agents, such as a water leak is a problem with is a water issue. Obviously, a flash flood is a water issue. So we're going back to that one agent. Inappropriate funding from your administration could eventually result in your building not being kept up, which could be a collapse from high winds, or that flooding, or which all traces back to one of these agents, including pest infestation or dissociation. So any problem you have can eventually be traced to an agent of deterioration. And it can be such a minor, small disaster to a much bigger implementing disaster that's caused by an external force. So you really want to focus in, and really when you write those emergency plans and so forth, focus on those 10 agents and learn them well and use them as part of your vocabulary when you're speaking to your administrators. So it's not all over the map, but you're really just focusing on these 10. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Rebecca. Daniel, you have worked on a variety of issues related to historic preservation, disaster preparedness, response and recovery. What are some common issues? Also, what are some of the gaps, for instance, that many museums don't consider or even think about?
I'll try to take both of those questions kind of concurrently. I think the gaps that people don't think about are basically traceable to a loss of control over exposure to those 10 agents of deterioration. And you can kind of think about that as something unexpected happens when you're not thinking that things are going to be different than they've always been. And one of the things we're seeing as you look around the country and you look around the world is things are changing in ways that are unprecedented, whether it's the recent flooding in the Midwest, or current flooding in Louisiana. The Louisiana certainly gets its share of floods. This incredible heat wave that's going to be rolling across the country in the next couple of days, Hurricane Sandy, the devastation that occurred in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands from 2 hurricanes about 20 months ago, something like that. You know, all of these things, wildfires, earthquakes, are things that we don't think of as part of our normal day-to-day business. And yet, more and more, we're seeing cultural institutions, art institutions being subjected to them. And so we have the unexpected. You know, people in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for example, never really thought of themselves as being vulnerable to wildfire. And yet, a couple of years ago, we saw wildfire tear through a good chunk of that town. California's been experiencing wildfire. Washington, Oregon's been experiencing wildfire. And we've built communities and institutions in areas that are vulnerable to that. And yet our management of those institutions doesn't always take those threats into consideration. One of the things that people consistently fail to anticipate in disasters is that all of their plans are predicated on things like utility systems being online, fire and EMS being online. They think in terms of disasters that are localized to their institution and their facility. When these larger disasters occur, they can completely compromise the ability of institutions and organizations to respond. They can affect staff who we were counting on to come in and address the threat. And yet suddenly those staff are having to deal with devastation to their own homes and communities. And so the scale and intensity of some of these disasters, I think, catches people by surprise and leaves them unprepared.
Thank you, Daniel. What happens if some of these things are man-made? I'm going to ask Susan a question. Susan, you and I both live in a city that is in the midst of rapid growth. We both look forward to a time when the dust settles and there's a sense of stability. But in the meantime, has a construction boom created circumstances that have altered day-to-day operations, conditions outlined in your standard facility reports, or applications to the NEA for indemnity?
Oh, thank you for asking, Jamal. Yes, in Nashville, because of a lot of construction here, we have vibration levels have changed or are a little bit inconsistent. And it's more of a slow burn in terms of emergency because it isn't catastrophic necessarily, but the conditions that we're sending to lenders have changed. So we immediately changed our facilities report so that when we're negotiating an expedition or an individual loan, that everyone knows that there's the possibility. And also there have been a number of ways that we've mitigated this. What happened here was we knew in advance there'd be construction in a nearby area. Fortunately for us, that's moving further and further away from the first art museum. But we needed to get readings, have seismographs, consult with engineers and various other people as if we were having earthquake. Not that it was anywhere near that catastrophic, but because it affects every one of us, we also needed to notify, when we had an incident, notify the National Endowment for the Arts, because we had an indemnity application out. So this has become information that we now supply regularly, both to our lenders and for always on our standard facility report and for the National Indemnity application form. I can go into more detail for anyone who has questions about this, but it's something we had not thought about 2 years ago, but now we think about all the time here.
Thank you, Susan. So when disaster strikes, I'm going to ask Barbara a question. Barbara, you've served on various roles and in multiple capacities in collections management. But as an insurer, when a disaster strikes, what are the 3 recommendations or advice that you could provide for pre- and post-emergency situations?
Thank you, Jamal. This is a little hard to net this all down to 3 recommendations. I did 3 for each: pre-storm or pre-event or post-event. So let's see. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Yeah, we were talking about agents of deterioration. In most cases, I'm dealing with different kinds of disasters because many agents of deterioration are not covered by insurance policies, as I'm sure you know. So, and as Daniel said, natural disasters are becoming more frequent and they're becoming more severe. So in my role, I am often working with our claims adjusters as well as our clients and their collections when disaster strikes throughout my zone, which is the Southeast and Central United States. So there's a lot of good reference material available to you on a variety of sites from AAM to AIC. And so actually creating a plan, there's a lot of templates and tools for that. Well, and so my 3 recommendations for pre-event would be, there are many resources, and I would do, let's see, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. What I would recommend is that you document your plan, you communicate your plan so everyone who needs to be aware of it and participate in it and knows what their roles and responsibilities are, and also to test your plan. And I'm not suggesting you should walk the Picasso out of your, out of the gallery, but you can do this with facsimiles. You can do this with the help of your first responders that are available to you locally, such as your fire department, your police department. So you actually know your plan will work should you have to pull the trigger on it. Okay, and then post-event, I'm going to speak mostly from an insurance perspective here. And that is, the first thing is you're going to file a claim. If you have damage or loss either to your building or your collection, you're going to be filing a claim. And so you need to let the adjuster know if the current conditions are safe and stable or not. Because the first thing the adjuster is going to want to do is they're first concerned with the safety of staff and visitors and anyone else who might be, facilities people who might be in the building. And want to know, is the building envelope sealed? So in other words, a windstorm is going by, a hurricane, is there still water leaking in from the roof, for the windows, through doors? And the adjuster will also want to know if the objects are stable. So for example, after a storm or a fire, are they likely to incur damage if they just stay the way they are for a short period of time? Or do they need to be conditioned, packed out, evacuated, have a conservator brought in to inspect, triage, and treat them? And so the adjuster is going to be coordinating all of these activities, or helping to coordinate all of these activities, at least paying for them in some cases. And so just sharing with the adjuster this information would be super helpful. And so also it would be important to document the event. If it's a storm, it's going to be pretty clear what happened. But say there's a major water leak or fire in your building, the adjuster is going to need to know, how did it happen? When did it happen? Who knows anything about it? You probably all have a form for doing this and providing this kind of information to the insurer. And the insurer is also going to be looking for, were there any third parties involved? For example, was there work being done on the building? Probably the worst example is Notre Dame in Paris. Who was up there with a flame torch, or who was smoking up there in that area, started the fire. So having that information for the adjuster is also very helpful. So let's see what else. And that's pretty much everything. And oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. Very often your coverage is not everything's on the policy schedule. It's blanket coverage, or maybe the underwriter only has a list of what's in a particular gallery that was used to determine your coverage limits. The adjuster is going to need a current list of all objects that might be affected because of what happened within the building. This doesn't matter if it's a natural catastrophe or a human-made one, such as a water leak or a fire in the building. And so this way, having an idea of what's in the building and a physical description of them, so in case you need help with bringing in resources like conservators and dirt handlers, they can do that. And that gives the adjuster a framework to work within, and to just have a better understanding of the claim so they can respond better for you. Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. You touched on a lot of key individuals. I'm going to open this question up to the group. What are the various roles that we should consider in emergency planning and disaster response?
take a
Sorry,
step.
excuse me. Oh.
Sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Well, I was just saying in our disaster preparedness, which has nothing to do with this sort of temporary situation with blasting, but in general, I think that we begin with our registrar. And we talked last time, one of the things I thought was so interesting is that everyone may be needed, but we have a sort of a chain of those people who are best skilled at working with art and assuming they can get in, you know, to go down that list of art handlers and preparators and so forth. And then who's the next round, and be ready just in case people cannot arrive, but have that written down rather than assuming you can put it all together at the last minute. Fortunately, we have a digital service called Preparedness that notifies everyone simultaneously of any kind of, even a fire drill or a disaster if it were to happen, but you still kind of need a system that's not unlike the old-fashioned telephone tree for priorities of people who are already skilled at removal of objects, in my opinion.
Daniel, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think I would focus on the people and the relationships external to your institution. And by that I mean, who can you call on for assistance? And make sure you've got those sort of mutual aid arrangements worked out ahead of time, so that your people know that they might get called to assist another institution and vice versa. And then working with emergency services so that, for example, if you have a fire, they understand that how they approach that situation, the tactics they use in fighting a fire, is really important to the success of the institution and the collections going forward. For example, you wouldn't want to use heavy equipment to turn over the collections because they're still hot, because they're trying to put out the fire, because that would do far more damage to the collection than the actual fire did. And having people understand that ahead of time is really important. The other external relationship I think is important is having people within your organization who understand emergency incident management and the incident command system, so that in the event of an incident, regardless of what kind, whether it's a storm or a fire or a wildfire or a human-caused incident, you have people on your staff who understand how to work within that system so that they can be effective in communicating the needs of your institution to get the institution and the collections the help it needs as quickly as possible.
I just want to weigh in real quick. I think, you know, when you're doing your annual, hopefully, risk assessments of your institutions, this should be a collaborative effort between all the major departments in your building, plus your facilities people, your safety. If you do landscaping, your landscape people, but risk assessment should be done as a large group and not just as little individuals doing their own areas of expertise, because everyone's going to see something different because they're experts in those areas. But that's when you start building those relationships and you start having those conversations right then and there, and not in a stuffy conference room, but where the actual problems are happening. So having those annual risk assessments where you can see that, oh, this problem was here in 2018, here it is again in 2019, we really should get this on the budget. Those people who can make that happen are now in the room instantly and not in a meeting 3 months down the road. So have that on your schedule, make that part of your regular duties as assigned, that everyone has to participate in a risk assessment. I mean, not every single person, but at least one person from every department has to participate in a risk assessment. And the more you do those regularly, the less you'll have reoccurring problems. And that's more of a preventative nature, which is much more cost effective and much less stressful than a response.
And I would also add, if you're using any third-party service providers, such as art handlers that are evacuating objects to a storage facility or to a conservator, say, is just to make sure that those vendors also have emergency plans in place, because they are also going to be affected by the same. I mean, unless you're moving your objects outside of the affected area, the vendors are also going to be dealing with much of the same.
Thank you all. Does the planning change for human-centered disasters versus natural disasters?
I think some would argue there are no man-made disasters, but or there are no natural disasters. All natural disasters are man-made, but no, I think all the planning goes accordingly the same, because our response should be, the preparation for the response should be the same. We should be planning accordingly, we should be training accordingly, and we should have supplies accordingly, because we cannot anticipate what's going to happen. Anticipating will drive us crazy. We have to be prepared for anything that can occur, and that has to be within the confines of what we can afford, what we can store, and what our capacity issues are, whether that's time, manpower, administrative support, or finance. So we have to stay within those confines. So it's better to plan in a larger scale than to try to isolate man-made versus natural, in my opinion.
I would take I don't disagree, but I would say there are some differences. And where they come into play is when there is a disaster declaration and the sources of funding and assistance that come to be available when there is a federal disaster declaration. So having an understanding of funding sources, whether it's through public assistance and FEMA or HUD or the Small Business Administration, understanding that and being able to navigate that is really useful. And having access to colleagues who can help you navigate that is equally useful. And just to clarify, typically you're not going to see a federal disaster declaration on a quote unquote human caused disaster. It's more what we think of as natural disasters like hurricanes or big floods.
We tend to divide disasters by natural catastrophes and then everything else. So, we're looking at, are you at least aware of the likely natural catastrophes that are in your area? And Daniel, as you were saying earlier, very often there's more than one. And they're starting to show up in places we didn't expect. I was talking not too long ago with for a very important corporate collection who said Cleveland is the best place to be because there's no natural catastrophes here. And then back in June, they just had a 4.0 magnitude earthquake there. So I think as best we can, I think we can, if we can eliminate some things. I mean, down here in Florida, I have hurricane and wildfire. That's where we're focusing most of our energy. And then, of course, there's the man-made side, such as the fires inside and water leaks. But there can be detection devices that can help with that.
We keep talking about a plan, and so I want to ask a question to go a little bit deeper, is how can we best plan ahead and mitigate potential damages to our exhibitions, collections, or community partners?
Well, that's a nice, simple question. I think the place I would start is really sort of step back and, while you can't anticipate everything, systematically ask yourself, what are the things that could go wrong that we're not thinking about? Look around the country at what other institutions have experienced and say, realistically, Could we experience something like that? Could we see the sort of flooding that hit Iowa City where we are? And a lot of people will say, no, we couldn't because we never have before. And that's not the right answer. So expecting the unexpected and understanding that we are in a very different world than we planned for, that we built our institutions for, that we built our facilities for, that we built our communities for.
And you can also look historically to see whether, you know, there have been water leaks or fires in your building in the past, or what might have caused other damage, and just to make sure that those are buttoned up.
Yeah, I agree with Daniel quite a bit. Like, I feel like there's a lot of pressure in our community to keep what happens to us almost a secret and buttoned up a little bit too much, because our whole job is to protect our cultural heritage and protect our collections. And when we somehow, quote unquote, fail at that because of something internal or external, we're ashamed to talk about it in our community. Well, 99% of the time, it's some external element that made these disasters happen that was out of our control, and there's no reason to be ashamed about it. So if we actually kind of brushed off that shame, gave the horrible word a name, and decided to talk about it more, we could actually learn from each other's mistakes in a way that could be beneficial. And I think that could go a long way in helping each other, because we could have more open and honest conversations instead of these shy, like, I can't really talk about it. But the more we talk about it, the more open it will be, and the better we'll be and stronger. But that could lead to better trainings, better understanding of our equipment, better understanding of how we can move forward as a community. But we need to be more open about what happens to us and how lessons we've learned.
Well said.
Jamal, I'd like to, you know, for accreditation, we've all created disaster preparedness plans, but I was really moved by the notion that other than for accreditation and reaccreditation, we do tornado drills and fire drills and things like that, mostly about people and getting them out of the museum, but we don't do an annual risk assessment. So I think that's my takeaway today. That's a very good idea, not wait until it's something that's due to someone else. As Jamal and I know, we had our 100-year flood in Nashville. No one expected that. Luckily, we are built on high ground, but our neighbors were not. Down going east of us, our Symphony and Country Music Hall of Fame were not on such high ground, and luckily we could share our written disaster plan and our arrangements with Blue Mountain and so forth with others, and also we do have space to help our neighbors. So I think not only the annual assessment, but external relationships. I mean, we have a relationship with FISC where we are, you know, we're available to them, but I'm not sure that we've thought about everyone else in the community. And when that natural disaster occurs, and it's something that you're thinking, oh, well, we're not in the earthquake zone. We're certainly thought about tornadoes, and now we think more about floods, but it's always the unexpected that rewards that practice and reaching out for external relationships early.
Thank you, Susan. That was thank you. That was fantastic. You made some really valid points. I have a question from the audience. We've talked about it a little bit, but I think they want us to dive a little bit deeper into it. And so, does anyone have experience with disasters that they could share?
It was actually, in this particular case, a private client, but we were talking about a building with 800 objects. And Harvey was looming over Houston. The building was located very close to a bayou that was normally about 30 feet below the building. But after Harvey sitting around for a while, the water started to lap at the back door. And so I had to bring in art handling teams to condition, inventory, pack out, and move those 800 objects to 3 different storage facilities. It took about 3 days to do it, but it would have been better if the collector had an emergency plan. I mean, I have one, and it's somewhat flexible. It has to be, because all collections are different, and all buildings are different, all locations are different. But that's one example of how we didn't lose one object. We got everything out beforehand.
Anybody else care to share?
Let me speak a little bit about some of what's going on kind of post-hurricane. And I haven't looked closely at the situation in Puerto Rico because we've got folks down there handling that more directly. But I was down in the Virgin Islands last fall for about 5 weeks working on hurricane recovery. And I want to emphasize the scale of that disaster. Dozens and dozens of historic buildings whose building envelope is severely compromised. Windows are blown out, roofs are blown off, that sort of thing. And some of them got tarped up pretty quickly, but the bureaucratic and administrative process of dealing with, how do you find funding for repairs if you find funding for repairs, has dragged on to the point where the tarps are old now. Everywhere you go, you find little bits of blue plastic from the tarps that are falling apart. And you can stand in these absolutely phenomenal historic buildings, old plantation homes from the period of Danish occupation. And if it's raining outside, it's raining inside. And I had a heartbreaking experience of standing next to a harpsichord with water just cascading down on it. And the wood was all buckled, and there was mold on the floor, and there was mold on the wall, and the water continues to pour in. Things like that happen, and they're happening more and more. And when they happen in isolated places like the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico, the capacity of the community is severely stretched to the breaking point to deal with the things that we as members of the arts community or the curatorial community think of as important. A city like Houston has resources and has political clout to get the help that it needs. But I think we can all think of a lot of places that don't have the resources and that don't have the political clout to get the help that they need.
Just one story I can tell is what kind of got me even into the emergency world was I was working in Florida at a museum, and this was back in, not to age myself, but 2004, when Florida was hit by 6 hurricanes that summer. 4 of them were within a 6-week period, and our museum was within a direct path of 4 of those. And it got to the point where after a while there were literally no more dry spaces to evacuate the collection to prior to the hurricanes. And hurricanes seem safe because you're like, it's coming, it's fine. But after a while, there's nothing dry. The humidity is too high. There's no air conditioning. Nothing is working. So I made the decision to stop evacuating the collection and just let it be submerged underwater. And because that was actually the safest place for it, because when it was submerged underwater, it couldn't grow mold. There was no other place for me to take it. We had no funding for storage. We had no way to move it because all the roads were closed or underwater. If anything was dry, I tried to keep it dry and try to keep it out. But what we ended up doing was focusing on digging ditches around the exterior of the museum to redirect the water instead. And that's how we spent our time in between the hurricanes, was redigging these ditches instead of evacuating collections. And we were judged harshly for that by neighboring museums, that we didn't do these, move the collection instead. But actually we ended up being better off because we redirected water instead of moving collections. So it became a sort of this debate, and one I still have with myself was, did I do the right thing? but down the line, I think I did do the right thing, because what else was I to do with no resources? And so these are constant debates you have with yourself. But it was one of those things that I keep studying and keep trying to do, of like, you know, what do you do when you have no resources? So I spend a lot of my time now and a lot of my research trying to help museums with no resources, so that they don't get slammed by museums that do have resources for trying to be perfect instead of being practical. And I think that's something that we all face on a regular basis. And yeah, so it's tough to make those decisions, especially when you're stressed. But yeah, just so you know, that's what I did, and it was not well received. But lessons learned, right? And I would not change my decision, honestly, based on those circumstances. So that's my story. Yay. There you go.
That's actually another question that one of the members in the audience is asking is, what are some of the best lessons learned that you all have learned from disasters? And I'm going to open it up to the group.
Everyone who said do the risk assessments on a regular basis, because risk management and loss prevention can mean all the difference between saving your objects and losing them. And then that other piece about all you can do is plan for as best you can, but have it ready, so that maybe at least if conditions are completely different, it may be adaptable. But the last thing you want to be doing is having to make hard decisions when conditions on the ground are changing or dangerous. And so whatever preparation you can do beforehand, it can make the difference once the disaster has passed.
I think I would encourage people to, as they look at their disaster plan, to also ask, what are the circumstances that would prevent us from following this plan? And what do we do then? So that when you don't have a way to evacuate your collection and you're faced with, do we leave it submerged? You feel like you've thought that through, and you're following a plan. It's much easier to deal with both the physical stuff of moving objects or not moving objects, but also with the emotional side of it, which is, we all got into this field because we care about this stuff. And it's psychologically devastating to lose a collection. It's really hard. And having a plan in place and having done everything you can reasonably as you work through that plan to anticipate not every little thing that could go wrong, but the big things, like, what if we don't have power and aren't going to have power for weeks? What if there isn't a physical way to evacuate the collection? What then? And thinking through that stuff, I think is an effort that's well worth making.
I think one of the lessons learned I've seen over and over again is make sure you document not only the process, but you document the objects as they're being moved. There was one recovery effort that was done in Harvey where two cultural institutions decided that they were going to share a storage space because that was going to be financially feasible. They did not actually document what they were moving into the storage space. And then when it came time to move their stuff out, they argued over who belonged to whom. And you think that that would be easily dealt with, but once your stuff has been submerged in mud and gunk and everything, things are not so easily identifiable. So anyone who's ever done a training with me will know that I am a huge proponent of documentation. I force emergency documentation down people's throats because it is so vital for things not to become dissociated, one of the 10 agents of deterioration, during a disaster, but also to document your process and what you're doing, because funders, insurance, everyone like that wants to know what you're doing. Grant applications want to know what you're doing if they're going to fund you for recovery. So just so much energy needs to go into documentation. As much as it does not look appealing, it is so vitally important. So documentation needs to be a big part of your plan.
And I believe a number of collections management systems that we're all using to catalog and keep our collection information safe can also be a great tool during a disaster and emergency, because that's your data. That's the information. Even if you have to pull that information remotely, some systems allow you to do that. Because losing your collection information, that just sets you up for such a difficult time.
Thank you. Thank you all. We have a few more questions from the floor. Hold on one second. One is, could you provide examples of how to encourage curators to participate, to prioritize their collections?
Well, I think as a manager, if you're trying to do that, you make that part of the curator's performance plan. You say, here's what is expected of you. This year, we want you to prioritize things. And if it's a large collection, then maybe that's a multi-year effort. I think also you want people to be thinking about what objects are most at risk because of the material they're made from or their condition, which objects are unique as opposed to unusual. And what if you could only save one thing, or you could only save 10%, where would you put your efforts? And think through that and plan accordingly.
Jamal and Suzanne, it's very interesting because everyone is talking about their collections, and because we're non-collecting and have objects here on loan from other institutions, it's not sort of standard to ask when something's coming out on loan to have those curators prioritize. When we had our situation with the British Museum and their ancient artifacts from Rome, they actually had a prioritized list based on fragility, things that could withstand vibrations and so forth. But so sometimes it has to do with the material, and sometimes it has to do with the value to humanity and whether something's one or multiple. But that is something that perhaps other organizations can encourage as materials are going out, to provide that information to the registrar in the borrowing institution as well, because it's sort of late for a borrowing institution to make the priority choices for someone else's collection.
Thank you.
And well, in the general world, usually loans would be a first priority. You want to take care of the stuff you borrowed first when salvaging that. But to play devil's advocate here, in the world of social media and online presence, some museums who can't get their curators on board to select things, which in the world of a museum, a curator is a small portion of the history of the object. They're actually letting the community decide what are the priority objects. Because while the curator might see something as historically relevant for that collection, the community might see an object relevant to the actual history of how it represents them. So some museums are letting the community decide entirely, while some communities are letting the community weigh in at a certain percentage. So while the curators could rank something a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, the community then weighs in a level 1, level 2, level 3, and that could change the ranking of where things are on the priority list. So in some museums where they can't get the curators to weigh in, or they don't want the curators to make the priority list, they're letting the community decide what is a priority item, because that's how they feel like they're represented at the institution. So my devil advocacy weigh in.
Fantastic, and thank you for the response. I have another question, and that is, what type of training do you think that we should employ, or do you think that should be involved? in preparing for a disaster or emergency response.
Jamal, I'll jump in. Did you say what kind of training is involved?
Yes.
Right. So I think that's back to, it depends on who's responding and at what level, because you were talking about your external people. Who are you calling for fire? Who are you calling for water? You know, externally, people will have expertise on your own maintenance crew. Maybe the buildings and grounds or maintenance people may be more prepared to handle something like a hot water heater bursting that, you know, had, you know, gravity being what it is. Maybe it's going to end up in a gallery or a storage area. So, you know, everyone's going to have different expertise depending on what your particular crisis is. And then I think, and I go back to the ability to handle objects, because our top priority is always someone else's art, not our own. So that training level of handling objects I mentioned earlier is that there are people who have sort of A-list training down to, I mean, even myself, I'm probably way down on that food chain, but our art handlers and might be more skilled than even our curators, because the curators may be keepers of objects, but they don't know every object in the same way that people who deal with object movement all the time know that, whether they're internal or external. It's kind of a broad subject because everyone can't know everything, but just have it at your fingertips who knows how to handle which emergencies better.
And I also think as part of your risk management, loss prevention assessments and planning, part of that would be who's going to be responsible for what part of the plan. And I think as long as that's somewhat documented, and there's always going to be overlap, there's always going to be change, again, as conditions on the ground dictate, because maybe the registrar can't get to the museum at that moment, but at least you have some framework to start with.
I would.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry. I would, as you look at the plan, you need to drill down and say, okay, so we're talking about moving the collection, for example. What does that really mean? How big is the collection? How many person hours of trained people doing it is that going to take? And if you realize that, you know, that you've got 2 object handlers on staff and you're counting on them to do about 3 weeks worth of work in 48 hours, you're going to need people who are cross-trained to do that. And if you're a small institution where you have one person wearing lots of different hats, what are you going to do if that person is unable to respond? Again, you've got to have cross-training to kind of plus up the areas where there's extra effort needed and also mitigate the risk that is inherent in small institutions with short staffs.
Just to sort of add on to that, I mean, just to provide a list of types of trainings that I feel like are important to incorporate is I feel like people should understand sort of what the incident command structure is, not only for themselves, but to talk to first responders, and what are people's roles and responsibilities within the incident command structure, emergency documentation, and please train on post-disaster reentry protocol, such as in don't run into a building just because you can. It may not be safe. And just in general, safety, and that includes, for me, mental health. What you should understand the mental health implications of responding to an emergency. You can practice and train on conducting damage assessments and risk assessments. There can be training and general workarounds of how to work with emergency kits or emergency bins. You can do evacuation exercises, wet salvage exercises, which can be tabletop or full-blown scenarios. Long-term drying techniques, mold remediation, and fire response and recovery. Those are just some ones that I deal with on a regular basis for training, because that's what people need the most. And you can expand upon that. There's even we make people train on communication trees to make sure that they're getting the information, the text or the project alerts or things like that. But I think on average, we calculated that's about 24 hours of training a year, and you work about 2,000 hours a year. So it's not that much.
Fantastic. We have another question from the group. I'm going to have to apologize early because the text is rather small. So I have to lean in to read the long question. So I apologize for being so close to the screen. But the question is Susan, you make a great point about handling and moving objects. As an art professional moves between departments or into more administrative positions, they may lose practice with handling objects. With this in mind, do you have art handling training annually or every 2 years? Interested to hear from others too.
So we are actually a sort of what is known as a medium-sized museum. So we do have 2 full-time registrars and 3 full-time preparators. And yes, absolutely. In my career, I've worked in those one-woman organizations where you did a lot. And university museums where I'm working with work study students, and my art handlers were MFA students. So here, along the way, yes, training when you come in and retraining and so forth. Now I'm in a very fortunate situation where we have professional registrars and art handlers, but also contract art handlers in the community, so that if we couldn't reach our, A team, we can certainly find other people who are trained and constantly working at that. I think it is one of those things that is sort of ongoing, because there's often a little review before we bring a new exhibition in, because every exhibition is different and we're dealing with objects or 2D works. And we also have adequate storage to evacuate everything that would be on view. We have room to keep it in locked storage, and we have crate storage. So we're in an unusual situation in that we can be good stewards of almost anything that's entrusted to our care. But there's regular training. I think that it is true that the further I get away from being near the objects, the less confidence I have that I'm going to do things correctly. And I think that people have a sort of, self-assessment there. The curators are working more closely during installation than I am. As I said earlier, once you become the director, it's about getting that money for disaster recovery or being prepared for it proactively. But it was a very good question to be sure that as we move away, that we don't lose all that skill set.
Just to add on to it, one of the Smithsonian, has over 200 million artifacts, I'm sure more, in its collection. So if anything was to happen to it as a whole, they would need all hands on deck. So the Smithsonian Emergency Committee, known as PRICE, Preparedness, Response, and Collections Emergency, who the chair, I noticed, is one of the panelists, or not one of the panelists, one of the attendees. She does actually host once a year a hands-on workshop where every medium you could possibly think of is spread out on tables, and handling experts are there to help people come, and it's open to anyone. They can come and practice handling artifacts under the supervision of handling experts. And it just lets people have a refresher, or people who don't normally work with artifacts can come and practice. So it's a great way to just sort of have this open house day for people to come and practice object handling or get a refresher. And it's very low key, very friendly, and people seem to really enjoy it.
Rebecca, I have a question for you about that, because we do not allow any volunteers to handle any objects. Would that conference be open to people who are just interested, or does it require that you have a position where you would be handling objects? Is it a training, or is it?
I think what we allow everyone in, like, they can practice and just come and practice, because we feel like interns and volunteers should just have that experience in case they go on to someplace else. We don't want them to leave less trained than they came in. But I'm not sure what would actually happen. That would be up to the unit that was suffering if they wanted to let them actually help. But what if the only people who could come in were volunteers and interns? You don't want to turn them away.
I think in an emergency, that restriction on volunteer, that volunteers are not allowed to handle objects, I think that would go away in a hurry. Right. If it came down to the difference between saving it or potentially saving it and not having it at all.
Well, that's one thing we talk to low capacity museums who don't have a lot of staff, is that, look to your local community volunteer groups, such as the Rotary Club or a junior league, or even a sorority house or fraternity house if you want, but, some organization that's really well established, and train them like you would train an actual staff. Because if those people are willing to come in and help you on a volunteer basis, if something happened, then that's your community. Those are the people who are going to be there for you. And, we found out a lot that these, like Moose Lodges, Kiwanis Clubs, Rotary Clubs actually have large freezers at their clubhouses that they're happy to loan you if you need a freezer in an event of emergency. So it's great to build those relationships now. So if you're a low capacity museum when it comes to staff, these are the people you need to be reaching out to.
So I have a question. So, so how do we reach out and to I guess, what is the best way for us to reach out to our staff members once a disaster has occurred? And then also, how do we reach out to our volunteers as well?
I think I said earlier, we use the system Preparedness, which gets in touch with everyone simultaneously by text, phone, and email. We have, then by email, we can automatically contact all of our volunteers if needed. But I think the question is, what happens if these systems all go down? What's the backup plan for that? Because we're counting on technology to do so much for us. I lived in New York City, Rebecca, I'm sorry, I'm really dating myself, for 9/11. And, in 2001, the phone towers went down. We had no cell phones. We had limited transportation within the city. But we don't think of our cell towers going down, but they could in a natural disaster. So what's the next step for communicating with people? I think that assuming that you could have landlines, but a lot of people, and especially younger people who work in our museums, have no landlines. So we could lose cell phones and we could lose email connectivity. So, I think it's back to that, annual risk assessment. What's the plan? Where do we meet? Where do we all meet up if, disaster strikes? That's what disaster planning is. What if everything fails? And I think that Daniel's been so articulate about saying that a disaster is something, it's like what you aren't planning for. What have you not thought about?
Well, it's easy to get a little tactical here, and down here in Florida, where we are often out of power after a storm goes through, we have devices, like battery-powered walkie-talkies, things like that, and they worked years ago, and we just pull them out and we have them ready, and that's the best we can do.
We do have those for fire drills that we used to use a long time ago. Good reminder.
I think it's also worth just thinking through it and articulating with your staffs what your expectations of them are, particularly if there's an event that's having widespread impact beyond the institution itself. People need to know they're not going to be fired for not showing up because they've got something going on at home. Critical incident stress management is a thing, and the stress around dealing with incidents is a thing. And as leaders and decision makers within institutions, setting a tone that is humane is really important. It fosters loyalty. I think most of the folks I've dealt with in a variety of museums are incredibly dedicated, to the point where they would neglect their own family to take care of the collection. And maybe that's not quite what we want to have happen.
Dan, I've heard you talk in the past about, let's say if it's a fire and the fire department comes, and how it can you go into detail of or talk about the type of damage that can occur post when, let's say that when an incident occurs, the damage, the way that we respond to it can cause more damage than the actual incident occurred. Or even give an example.
Sure. So when a fire department responds to a structural fire, their mindset is put the fire out and keep it out. And to do that, they need to extinguish anything that's burning, all the coals, all the embers, and buildings on the inside may have coals and embers, and the best way to extinguish them from the fire department standpoint is to use heavy equipment. You know, turn that thing over and keep spraying it with water, and then turn it over again and keep spraying it with water. I don't think you need a real vivid imagination to understand the implications of turn that thing over and keep spraying it with water on your collection. So having that relationship with your first responders ahead of time so that they understand that turn it over and keep spraying it with water is not the best solution, is really important, because when there is a fire, you may not be able to actually get near it. The police will keep you away. Even if you're the museum director, they will keep you away until that fire is under control. So having the battalion leader or the fire chief or whatever that role is, understand ahead of time, have them walk through the institution ahead of time so they understand how important, how valuable, and how sensitive the contents of that building are, and how the way they approach fighting that fire will have a major impact on the long-term state of that collection. Have them understand that ahead of time, and get them invested in preserving that collection. That would be my advice.
Fantastic.
I worked on a claim where there was a fire at a major collection, and the fire department came in, literally took the roof off, put a hose down, and flooded everything. And what I heard was, well, better wet than burnt. So, you know, sometimes you have to deal with the conditions you have to deal with, and working with first responders, because knocking down the fire is absolutely the first thing they need to do, because fire spreads so incredibly quickly.
So I think we have about time for two more questions. And so this one is, we've talked about the objects and we've talked a little bit about mental health, but the question is really asking about, emphasizing humanity, and can we talk a little bit more about managing individual trauma during an emergency?
Well, I guess since I brought it up, maybe I'll take a quick stab at it. My experience has been that nobody really knows how they're going to respond to a situation until they're in it. I've seen the toughest, most macho person completely incapacitated by the sight of blood. And I've also seen the person who you really probably thought maybe you couldn't count on when things got bad, turn out to be the person you really wanted to have right there. I don't have any magic bullet. except to say that you need to expect that if you have an incident that's affecting the collection, particularly a serious incident, you're also going to have staff who are traumatized. And the way we deal with that early on, in early days, early hours after they're exposed to that trauma, makes all the difference in how well they get through it. And if you're a museum director, collections manager, someone in a leadership position within your institution, don't think you're immune. Don't trivialize it. Don't minimize it. Look out for yourself and make it okay for the people that you lead to look out for themselves.
Well said, Daniel. I would add one thing that's easier to do when you're the director, I suppose, and back to 9/11. It's not just, the immediate response, but I was in a much smaller museum at the time, and we brought in a therapist to have some sessions with staff because of the fact that any kind of trauma like this can bring up previous traumas, and you never know everything that's gone on in another person's life. So it can trigger old wounds as well, and I wouldn't assume that people who look like they're handling it well are not dealing with some post-traumatic issues. So it's extremely important. Initially, the people whose cars were flooded and their houses were destroyed in a flood or something, but you don't always know what the emotional impact will be for everyone because they know someone or it triggered something from the past.
Thank you, Susan. We have one final question. We have just enough time for this one question. And for the group, what are some resources available that would provide support or assistance during and after an aftermath?
Jamal, do you think this is someone who's asking about emotional support for the staff?
No, I think they're just asking for any websites like the AIC, American Institute for Conservators, or anything like that. So I think they're just asking just for what are some resources that we could provide.
Well, there is a wiki page for emergency response on the American Institute for Conservation. It's Preparedness and Response. There's also the phone number for the National Heritage Responders, which I do not know off the top of my head, but you can Google National Heritage Responders and you'll get their phone number. Those are really great resources that are available 24 hours a day if you've suffered some sort of damage, and a conservator can help you answer any questions about any sort of damage that's been done to your collection. There's also the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, has a lot of resources on their page, and they're also hosting the page for the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is 58 organizations that have joined together in a partnership to help respond to disasters affecting cultural institutions. So that's HENTF, HENTF.si.edu. So that's a large national place to start.
And you can also look to your local service providers. Very often conservators, especially those that are already familiar with the collection, can be very good for helping to respond and guiding the response.
I would encourage people to look beyond the borders of the United States. The Canadian Conservation Institute does very good work and has a lot of information available. And then, ICOMOS and some of the European institutions have been dealing with disasters of one sort or another since long before the United States was formed. And they have a wealth of information as well.
Yeah.
Jamal, I just thought of one thing. It might be a little off subject for our audience, but we did talk about some private collections and some individual artists. And we all know of artists who've had studio fires or floods. And there are artist organizations. I don't know the name of the one right now, but our colleague here in Nashville, Craig Nutt, has created a lot of guidelines for people who are visual artists who deal with objects. And so in advance, I mean, you know, I think I'm inspired to put together a list or at least a list of places we would go and recommend for our colleagues who may not be affiliated with an institution, because their losses can be just as devastating.
Thank you. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all for participating. All of the links have been populated on the Zoom webinar chat. I hope that we can always keep these conversations going as we look to protect and preserve our collections. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you to everyone. I've learned a lot.
Thank you, everyone.